Bryson's, it really kind of works this way quite aggressively, where the handle trails the club head, creates this super wide look, and he's able to snap that thing back down. So creating the correct loading patterns as it relates to how we use our right arm and wrist is really a key ingredient in developing a solid impact.
Yeah.
And what I'm demonstrating here is how we can use the trail hand and the trail arm in a manner where I'm actually underloading the club at the beginning to try and create some angle into the downswing, which you really see with all good ball striking, especially iron players.
Yeah. We would say, pertaining to impact, right, a very common pattern that you would see with a recreational golfer would be that they would tend to have this casting motion, as they would refer to it, right? Or where the golf club would essentially get further away from them.
Correct.
In the downswing. And we would almost see the opposite pattern, narrow in the backswing and then wide in the downswing. And what you're showing us here is the opposite.
Absolutely. And often we will teach, or we see our students, as you were referring to, for whatever reason, they will tend to get the either right arm breaking way too early, creating this really narrow look. They don't really get their bodies working in tandem with the arm. And we see this, as you said, really narrow look in the backswing with often a collapse, with the club sort of thrown out away from them. So we do an exercise here. We try and create some awareness in actually how the wrists work first, which is really important. And the lead wrist working more in this up and down fashion, creates an angle that we can work with on the downswing. And the trail wrist working back on itself this way also adds that angle quite significantly. And so in a lot of cases, we're to kind of almost overtrain this or give it a real sense of it, we create some underloading feel on the way back. And we certainly see this with some of the older ball strikers like Hogan and some of the speed getters out there. Bryson's, it really kind of works this way quite aggressively, where the handle trails the club head, creates this super wide look, and he's able to snap that thing back down, create super strong impact alignments. And not only that, it's a huge speed move as well, I would say, in a lot of cases.
And would you see that a lot of the long drivers out there and players in pursuit of more speed, they would benefit from getting this feeling of going really wide on the backswing and then almost that narrowing of the arc on the downswing, you'd say?
Absolutely, and it can just help with creating some angle in the downswing, which they can obviously use to release at the bottom. And there's certainly, an overdue component to this, but we're really looking at students that underload on the way back and really overload on the way down and trying to change that pattern.
Yeah, so they essentially get very narrow. If you set up to that ball for me, I would say that the player who tends to get the shaft, let's say the end of the shaft here near the head, the closest to them earlier in the backswing, and then in the downswing, gets it further away from them the earliest as well. So they're getting very narrow to wide, whereas the professional and the player who tends to hit it the furthest would tend to be quite wide and then have this narrowing. And that's that beautiful lagging sensation and look that you see with a lot of the best players, right?
Absolutely. And conceptually, I always think about this when I'm explaining this to a student. If you were to throw a ball, for distance and for power, how would I position my right arm, and even how would I position my right wrist? And we wouldn't go back with the wrist, completely unhinged here, and I wouldn't go back with a straight right arm. And I wouldn't even go back if I was to allow some movement here in a really crouched position. I'm going to create some space here, a little bit of sort of loading on the way back, but not all of it. So as I kind of move forward and step, I create this natural look and load. And we see this when students grab a whippy shaft, or if they just naturally throw a ball down there. It's amazing the dynamics that they have. Baseballers do it. We often see, a lot of really cool pictures and how sometimes the downswing moves related to what baseball do, or even how they kind of go back and they load that position.
How much of this do you believe is that the players are just so cognizant and aware of what their arms are doing, rather than getting used to feeling of creating more of a big body turn, which keeps the arms wide? You see that players, they generally don't activate this torso very well, and they would tend to get that effect. And where we see the trail arm not really do anything, and the wrists will tend to get quite hinged close to themselves quite fast. Let's call it a snatchy, quick takeaway. For me, when I'm coaching players, I see so much of that happen due to a lack of awareness of the upper body. So this drill here, would you say kind of ties in with creating that awareness?
Absolutely. So as you mentioned, even though we've spoken a lot about how the arms and wrists sort of underload here, the driver is definitely the core and the torso kind of moving things away first. And as you can kind of see as I'm demonstrating, I've got 2 tees behind the golf ball. I can create a little bit of resistance as I really work my upper body almost to the look where I'm overturning this and underusing this, but eventually it will catch up as I transition. And that's really the key thing that we're trying to convey in this message.
Would you see that as a natural reaction? Because the player who was doing this drill, let's say they're very used to getting very handsy and wristy off the golf ball, get very narrow, by having that point of resistance that you've got there with the tees, that naturally encourages more of this body rotation. And because it feels a lot wider than they're used to, in that then transition into the downswing, you'll see a huge difference in the way that the shaft reacts.
Big time. Yeah, it's almost like the further you can get this away, there can be only one way to go on the way down, and there's a weight on the end of the shaft here, and when we get into this area here, it does want to work more in this fashion versus if it's in this narrow position, it also wants to work in the opposing fashion. So it's amazing what the club can do naturally when it's positioned correctly.
Yeah, and I think when players simply, let's say they grab 2 or 3 golf clubs together and they just hold them, sure, it's not going to be comfortable, and they try and move the golf club away in, let's say, a manner which would narrow it quite early, even though it feels easy to do with 1 club because it's quite light, they do it with 3 and like, oh my God, that's an effort. But they have to, like if you're swinging a medicine ball, you would have to use momentum and extension to position this ball in such a spot. And then naturally, because of the heavy object, we would tend to see great loading patterns if golf clubs, well, the game was played with 10-kilo golf clubs, right? All the time.
100%. So I like what you said there, even getting the club, upside down here, we can create a lot more feel in the wrists here, and I'm still kind of using my body to get it away. I can naturally start to allow this shaft, especially if I really put no pressure in there, just on my fingertips, I can get a sense of how the shaft is wide towards you and then almost feels like it's falling onto my right shoulder. Now, that's not a steep position in that sense. I would say it's just a more narrow position because, as you can see, the club's sort of flat there, and I can start to get the sound past the ball.
Correct.
I think that's
and I would say one
idea.
One more thing before we actually put this into the practical application for the guys is that this angle that Steve is creating here, it's not done from a hinging of the wrist in such a manner in which the trail arm is bending more and more, like a lot of players are trying to do by trying to force this lag. Essentially it is that lag is created from the angle between the club shaft and the forearm. It's not done from dragging the trail arm in front.
Correct.
Yeah, great.
In fact, I'd say I'm staying quite soft when I do that. It's not a forced thing.
Absolutely. Okay, so walk us through this. So the guy at home who is very handsy off the golf ball, right? They don't really have much control, not much upper body motion, creating the movement on that initial stage of the swing. So they're going to use just 1 hand or 2 hands here?
You can start off doing this 1 hand. I would say just support that with your left hand on the bicep when you're doing this, just for a bit of control.
Yeah.
But the way I would like to do it is I would have these 2 tees behind the ball, and I'd just practice getting the body to move, getting that club to kind of almost just sit on those tees for a while, and you can almost see the gripping gets behind my right hip pocket before I let the club catch. And it's interesting when you do this, the club will naturally want to create some sort of load as I go from turning back and then transitioning forward. And if I just hit a little one out there to demonstrate, I kept my wrist angles a little more stable through the ball just to show how I sustain those angles to create a really strong low ball flight.
So let's say the player who was first going to experiment with this, they would do a dry drill without a golf ball, right? Maybe
Absolutely.
just a trail hand. I would say it's quite an advanced move to be able to hit the golf ball just with 1 hand.
Yep.
Look, we're not all as good as you, but we would go without a golf ball first with 1 hand. I think 1 hand's important because you can't muscle it with 2.
Correct.
And then keep the wrists soft, get the feeling with 2. And even if you were just to show us right now of just hitting the ground in front of those tees where we can imagine where the ball would be. I'd say this, guys, is a great exercise that you can practice at home that's really going to go a long way in helping improve that feeling of creating that more load in the golf swing.
And I like what you said about keeping the wrists soft or keeping them oily. I can still have a very, very secure feeling in my fingertips, but I can really move this thing all over the place with an element of control. So I would say fingers secure, oily wrists, and really allow the club, allow you to feel the end of the club in the transition, and I'm able to create that look there where I go from wide to narrow.
Yeah, and we can even like hear that audible feedback there and the divot, mate. I think this is a fantastic drill for a lot of players to work on. Good job.